If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1: Shadows over Egypt, the Land of Bondage. Part 1: The Arrival of Jacob's Descendants. Promise turns to peril. The 70 members of Jacob's family stepped into Egypt with hope filling their hearts. Joseph, their beloved brother who had risen to become Pharaoh's right hand, welcomed them with open arms. The fertile Delta region offered everything they needed: rich pastures for their flocks, abundant water, and protection from the terrible famine that had driven them from Canaan. Pharaoh himself had blessed their arrival, recognizing their skill as shepherds and their value to his kingdom. The land of Goshen became their new home, where they could maintain their traditions while enjoying Egyptian prosperity. Joseph's influence opened doors that would have remained closed to ordinary foreigners. These Hebrew families found themselves in a position many could only dream of: honored guests in the world's greatest civilization. Years turned into decades and decades into centuries. The Hebrew families multiplied with remarkable speed. What began as 70 people grew into thousands, then tens of thousands. Children filled the settlements in Goshen, and their laughter echoed across the Delta. The Hebrews prospered in ways their ancestors could never have imagined, building communities, establishing trades, and creating a thriving society within Egypt's borders. But this success planted seeds of future trouble. As the Hebrew population swelled, their presence became impossible to ignore. Egyptian neighbors watched with growing unease as entire districts filled with people who looked different, spoke a different language, and followed different customs. Marketplaces buzzed with whispered concerns about these foreigners who seemed to multiply faster than the native Egyptians. The political landscape began to shift when new dynasties rose to power. Pharaohs who had never known Joseph took the throne, and they saw the Hebrew situation through different eyes. Where previous rulers had seen valuable allies, these new leaders saw potential threats. The Hebrews had grown too numerous, too organized, and too comfortable in their adopted land. Fear crept into the royal court like a slow poison. Advisors whispered warnings about the Hebrew population explosion. What if war came and these people sided with Egypt's enemies? What if they decided to leave all at once, taking their skills and labor with them? What if they grew bold enough to challenge Egyptian authority? These questions haunted the new Pharaoh's thoughts and influenced every decision he made about the Hebrew people. The comfortable relationship between Egyptians and Hebrews began to crack under the weight of suspicion. Egyptian workers complained that Hebrews were taking jobs and land. Religious leaders worried about foreign influences corrupting traditional beliefs. Military commanders feared the security implications of such a large foreign population living so close to Egypt's borders. What had begun as a rescue mission for a starving family had transformed into a demographic challenge that threatened to reshape Egypt itself. The stage was set for a dramatic change in the Hebrews' fortune, one that would test their faith, their unity, and their survival in ways their ancestors never could have imagined when they first sought refuge in the land of the Nile. Part 2: Pharaoh's Fear and the Rise of Oppression. The new Pharaoh paced the marble floors of his palace, his mind racing with troubling thoughts. Reports from his advisors painted a picture that kept him awake at night. The Hebrew population had grown beyond all expectations. Where once they numbered in the hundreds, now they filled entire districts of Egyptian cities. Their children played in streets that once echoed with Egyptian voices alone. Fear gripped the ruler's heart. He imagined scenarios that made his blood run cold. What if Egypt's enemies attacked? Would these Hebrews fight for Egypt or against it? Their loyalty remained questionable at best. They spoke their own language, followed their own customs, and worshipped their own God. To Pharaoh, they seemed like a nation within his nation. The king called his closest advisors to an emergency meeting. "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we," he declared, his voice heavy with concern. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Egypt's strength had always come from controlling its people completely. Now, a group lived among them that owed no allegiance to Egyptian gods or Egyptian ways. Pharaoh's solution was swift and brutal. If he could not control the Hebrews through kindness, he would control them through force. The royal decree went out across the land. Hebrew families would no longer live as free people. They would become slaves, property of the Egyptian state. Egyptian taskmasters appeared in Hebrew neighborhoods with whips and chains. Men who had worked as craftsmen and traders found themselves hauling massive stones under the scorching sun. Women who had managed households now labored in Egyptian fields from dawn to dusk. Children watched their parents stumble home each evening, backs bent with exhaustion and pain. The Pharaoh's strategy went beyond simple labor. He wanted to break their spirit entirely. Hebrew families were separated and scattered across different work sites. They were forbidden to gather for their religious practices. Their children were denied education. Every aspect of Hebrew culture came under attack. The construction projects grew more demanding each month. Hebrews built storage cities, monuments, and palaces with their bare hands. They mixed mortar with their own sweat and tears. The Egyptian overseers showed no mercy, driving them harder whenever they showed signs of weakness. Yet Pharaoh's plan contained a fatal flaw. The harder he pressed, the more the Hebrew identity solidified. Shared suffering created bonds stronger than iron. Whispered prayers passed between workers. Stories of their ancestor Abraham spread through the slave quarters. Hope, though flickering, refused to die completely. The oppression that was meant to destroy them instead prepared them for something greater. In the darkness of their bondage, a longing for freedom grew stronger each day. They began to cry out to the God of their fathers, setting in motion events that would soon shake Egypt to its very foundations. Part 3, the Decree of Death. Hebrew infants in peril. The cries from their prayers had barely faded when Pharaoh's new terror began. The king of Egypt had watched the Hebrew population continue to grow despite the backbreaking labor he had imposed. His advisors brought disturbing reports each month. More Hebrew children were being born. More families were forming. The slave quarters overflowed with young voices that spoke of hope. Pharaoh's hands trembled with rage as he paced his throne room. The forced labor had failed. The whips and chains had only made the Hebrews stronger. Their numbers still climbed like the flooding Nile each year. Something more drastic had to be done. Something that would cut the problem at its root. The decree came swiftly and without warning. Every newborn Hebrew boy must die. Pharaoh's soldiers would patrol the Hebrew settlements. Midwives would report all births. Any family caught hiding a male child would face execution. The order spread through Egypt like wildfire, reaching every corner where Hebrew families lived in fear. Terror gripped the Hebrew mothers. Women who had carried children for months now faced an impossible choice. They could obey Pharaoh's command and watch their sons die, or they could resist and risk their entire families. The sound of weeping filled the slave quarters day and night. Fathers stood helpless as their wives held newborns close, knowing each day might be their last together. But something remarkable happened in the darkness of this horror. Some Hebrew families refused to surrender. Mothers found ways to hide their children. They dug secret chambers beneath their homes. They wrapped infants in cloth and carried them to relatives in distant villages. They bribed Egyptian neighbors with their meager possessions to keep silent about crying babies. The midwives Shiphrah and Puah became heroes of quiet rebellion. When Pharaoh summoned them and demanded they kill Hebrew boys during birth, they nodded respectfully but continued to help children live. They told Pharaoh that Hebrew women were stronger than Egyptian women and gave birth too quickly for them to intervene. Their courage saved countless lives. Each act of defiance carried enormous risk. Families lived in constant fear of discovery. They developed signals to warn of approaching soldiers. Children learned to stay silent at the sound of footsteps. Entire communities became networks of protection, with neighbors watching out for each other's children. The decree revealed something profound about the human spirit. Even under the most brutal oppression, hope refused to die. Parents risked everything for their children's future. Strangers helped each other survive. Small acts of courage multiplied into a movement of resistance that Pharaoh could not crush completely. This dark chapter planted seeds that would later bloom into something extraordinary. Among the children saved during this terrible time would emerge leaders who remembered both the cruelty of Egypt and the power of those who chose courage over fear. The Hebrew people were learning lessons that would serve them well when the time came to leave their bondage behind forever. Part 4. Birth and Secret Adoption. Moses in Pharaoh's Palace. In the shadow of Pharaoh's deadly decree, Hebrew mothers faced impossible choices. One woman from the tribe of Levi watched her belly grow with a mix of joy and terror. She already had 2 children, Miriam and Aaron, and knew what awaited this child if it was a boy. When her time came, she gave birth in secret. The baby was a son, and he was beautiful. For 3 months, she hid him in her home. Every cry had to be muffled. Every visitor was a potential threat. But babies grow, and their voices grow stronger. Soon, hiding him would become impossible. The woman knew she had to act before someone discovered them both. She wove a basket from reeds and sealed it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof. Then she did what seemed like madness. She placed her precious son inside and set him among the reeds along the Nile River. Her daughter Miriam hid nearby, watching to see what would happen to her baby brother. The morning sun glinted off the water as Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe. She was royalty, surrounded by her attendants, enjoying the cool relief the river offered from Egypt's heat. Something caught her eye among the reeds, a strange basket floating near the shore. Curious, she sent one of her servants to retrieve it. When she opened the basket, she found a crying Hebrew baby. Despite knowing exactly what this meant, her heart was moved. Here was one of the children her father had ordered killed, yet she could not bring herself to carry out his cruel command. The baby's cries touched something deep within her. Miriam stepped forward with courage beyond her years. She approached the princess and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. The princess agreed, and Miriam ran to fetch her own mother. In a twist that must have seemed like divine intervention, the baby's birth mother was hired to nurse her own son. The child grew strong under his mother's care until he was old enough to be weaned. Then, as promised, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. She named him Moses, saying she had drawn him from the water. Moses grew up in the royal palace, receiving the finest education Egypt could offer. He learned to read and write in hieroglyphs, studied mathematics and astronomy, and was trained in the arts of leadership and warfare. Yet he also knew his true identity. His birth mother had likely whispered the truth to him during those precious nursing years, and the knowledge of his Hebrew heritage remained alive in his heart. This created a profound tension within Moses. By day, he enjoyed the privileges of Egyptian royalty. He ate fine foods, wore expensive clothes, and commanded respect from servants and officials. But he carried the weight of knowing he belonged to the very people his adoptive grandfather sought to destroy. The palace walls that protected him also imprisoned him in a complex identity. He was Hebrew by blood, but Egyptian by upbringing. This duality would later prove essential to his role as a leader who could speak to both worlds, but for now it simply made him a young man caught between 2 peoples. Part 5. Exodus deferred. Moses flees to Midian after an act of defiance. The burden of his dual identity finally pushed Moses to breaking point. Walking through the Hebrew work camps one scorching afternoon, he witnessed an Egyptian overseer brutally whipping a Hebrew slave. The crack of the whip against human flesh echoed the tension that had been building within Moses for years. This wasn't just another act of cruelty he could witness in silence. Moses looked around quickly. No one else was watching. His royal training had taught him decisive action, and his Hebrew blood demanded justice. In one swift movement, he struck down the Egyptian taskmaster. The man fell dead in the sand. The weight of what he had done hit Moses immediately. He buried the body hastily, hoping no one had seen. But secrets in Egypt rarely stayed hidden for long. The next day, when Moses tried to stop 2 Hebrews from fighting, one of them sneered at him. "Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Terror gripped Moses. If the Hebrews knew, others would soon know too. Pharaoh's justice was swift and merciless, even for adopted grandsons. Moses had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer safe in the only home he had ever known. That same day, Moses learned that Pharaoh had indeed heard about the killing and had ordered his death. The palace guards were already searching for him. The prince who had once walked confidently through golden halls now ran for his life across the desert. Moses fled eastward toward Midian, leaving behind his comfortable life forever. The journey was harsh. The desert sun burned his skin, and his royal clothes became tattered rags. He had traded a palace for the wilderness, certainty for the unknown. In Midian, Moses discovered a different world entirely. He was no longer a prince, but a refugee with nothing. At a well, he defended some shepherd women from aggressive herders. This act of kindness led to his meeting Jethro, a Midianite priest who offered him shelter and work. Moses married Jethro's daughter Zipporah and settled into the quiet life of a shepherd. Day after day, he led flocks across rocky hills and through desert valleys. The man who had once commanded servants now followed sheep. This humble work taught him patience and stripped away his royal pride. Years passed in this simple existence. Moses learned to read the desert's moods, to find water in dry places, and to protect vulnerable animals from predators. These skills seemed ordinary, but they were preparing him for something extraordinary he could not yet imagine. The exile that began with an act of violence had become a period of deep transformation. Moses was no longer the conflicted prince torn between two worlds. He was becoming someone entirely new, shaped by hardship and humility, ready for a divine encounter that would change everything. Chapter 2, The Divine Call, Moses' Mission Unveiled. Part 1, The Burning Bush, God's Voice in the Wilderness. The afternoon sun blazed across the rocky slopes of Mount Horeb as Moses led his father-in-law's sheep to higher ground. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a familiar sight after 40 years of exile from Egypt. What had once felt like punishment now offered peace and routine. Moses had found contentment in this simple life, far from the palace, intrigues, and slave quarters of his youth. A strange flicker caught his eye among the thorny bushes ahead. Fire danced within the branches of an ordinary desert shrub, yet something felt different about these flames. Moses stopped and stared. The fire burned bright and steady, but the bush remained whole. Its leaves stayed green, its branches uncharred. This defied everything he understood about fire and wood. Curiosity pulled him closer. Each step revealed more impossible details. The flames seemed to burn from within each leaf and twig, yet cause no destruction. Moses had seen many desert fires during his years as a shepherd, but nothing like this. The sight both fascinated and unnerved him. "Moses! Moses!" The voice came from within the fire itself, clear and commanding. Moses froze, his heart pounding. No human throat could produce such a sound. It carried weight and authority that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. "Here I am," Moses whispered, barely able to form the words. "Do not come any closer," the voice continued. "Remove your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground." Moses obeyed without question, his hands trembling as he untied his leather sandals. The rocky earth felt cool against his bare feet. Every instinct told him to run, yet he remained rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the burning bush. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Terror washed over Moses. He covered his face with his hands, afraid to look directly at this divine presence. The God of his ancestors spoke to him now, the same God whose stories his mother had whispered during his childhood in Egypt. The voice continued with gentle authority. "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries under their slave masters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to rescue them from Egyptian hands." Moses listened in amazement, as God described a plan to lead the Hebrew people out of bondage to a land flowing with milk and honey. The scope of this divine vision overwhelmed him. Freedom for an entire nation seemed impossible under Pharaoh's iron rule. Then came the words that changed everything. "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." The weight of this commission crashed down upon Moses like a desert storm. God was asking him to return to the very place he had fled, to confront the most powerful ruler on earth, and to demand the release of hundreds of thousands of slaves. The task seemed beyond any mortal man's ability. Part 2. Reluctant Prophet, Moses' Doubts and Divine Assurances. Moses stood frozen before the burning bush, his shepherd's staff trembling in his weathered hands. The impossible mission God had just given him felt like trying to move mountains with bare fingers. Who was he to stand before Pharaoh? Who was he to lead an entire nation out of slavery? The words tumbled from his lips before he could stop them. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? His voice cracked with doubt. 40 years of herding sheep in the wilderness had made him forget the confident prince he once was in Pharaoh's palace. Now he felt like nothing more than a fugitive with calloused hands and sun-darkened skin. God's response came with gentle firmness. I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. But Moses needed more than promises. His mind raced with practical concerns that seemed impossible to overcome. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" Then what shall I tell them? Moses had spent decades away from his people. Would they even remember him? Would they trust a man who had abandoned them for the comfort of Midian's pastures? The divine voice thundered with authority that made the very ground tremble. I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. The name carried weight beyond human understanding, but Moses still felt the crushing burden of inadequacy pressing down on his shoulders. His protests came faster now, desperation creeping into his voice. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, "The Lord did not appear to you"? The fear was real and sharp. These were people broken by generations of slavery, their spirits crushed under Pharaoh's whips. Why would they follow him? God's patience never wavered. He told Moses to throw his staff to the ground, and it became a writhing serpent. Moses jumped back in terror, but when God commanded him to grab it by the tail, it turned back into wood. Then God instructed him to put his hand inside his cloak. When Moses pulled it out, it was white with leprosy, diseased and horrible. Another command, and his hand returned to normal, healthy flesh. These signs will convince them, God assured him. But Moses had one final desperate plea. Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. The divine response carried a hint of growing impatience. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Moses made one last attempt to escape his destiny. Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. The words hung in the desert air like a challenge to heaven itself. God's anger burned, but his solution revealed divine wisdom. What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you. The plan was taking shape, combining Moses' authority with Aaron's eloquence. Moses realized his objections had been answered one by one. God had provided signs, words, and even a spokesperson. The path ahead remained terrifying, but it was no longer impossible. He would return to Egypt, not as the prince he once was, but as something far more powerful, a man carrying the authority of heaven itself. Part 3. Return to Egypt. The reunion with Aaron and Moses walked the familiar paths back toward Egypt, but everything felt different now. The shepherd who had fled 40 years earlier was returning as something else entirely. His staff felt heavier in his hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Each step brought him closer to a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the mightiest empire on earth. The reunion happened exactly as God had promised. Aaron appeared on the road, traveling toward the wilderness to meet his brother. Their eyes met across the dusty path, and years of separation dissolved in an instant. Aaron's face showed surprise, relief, and something deeper, recognition that this moment had been ordained. Moses had wondered how to explain his incredible mission, but Aaron's presence confirmed that God had already been at work. The brothers embraced, and Moses began to share everything that had happened at the burning bush. Aaron listened intently as Moses described God's commission, the signs he had been given, and the impossible task ahead. When Moses finished, Aaron nodded slowly. He had received his own calling, his own inner certainty that this was the moment their people had waited for. The brothers understood they were pieces in a larger plan, each bringing something essential to the mission. Aaron's gift for words complemented Moses' divine authority perfectly. Where Moses stumbled over phrases, Aaron could speak with clarity and power. Where Aaron might lack the direct connection to God's presence, Moses carried that burning certainty from the mountain. Together, they formed a complete messenger, capable of addressing both Hebrew slaves and Egyptian royalty. They made their way to the Hebrew settlements, gathering the elders and leaders. The enslaved people had heard rumors and whispers about Moses for decades: the prince who had killed an overseer, the fugitive who had disappeared into the desert. Now he stood before them, weathered by years in the wilderness, claiming to carry a message from the God of their fathers. Aaron spoke while Moses performed the signs. The staff became a serpent and returned to wood. Moses' hand turned leprous white and healed instantly. Water from the Nile turned to blood when poured on the ground. The signs were unmistakable, and the people's response was immediate. They bowed down and worshipped, recognizing that God had finally heard their cries. The Hebrew elders agreed to support Moses and Aaron, but everyone understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. Pharaoh was not just a king, but was considered a god by his people. His power seemed absolute, his armies invincible. Yet Moses and Aaron felt the weight of divine backing, and they began preparing for the confrontation that would determine the fate of an entire nation. The brothers spent their final hours before the palace meeting in prayer and strategy. They knew Pharaoh would resist, but they could not imagine the epic battle of wills about to begin. Part 4. Confronting Pharaoh. Let my people go. The massive bronze doors of Pharaoh's throne room stood 30 feet high, decorated with images of gods and conquered peoples. Moses felt his heart racing as palace guards led him and Aaron through corridors lined with golden statues. The air smelled of incense and exotic oils, and everywhere they looked, hieroglyphs proclaimed Pharaoh's divine status. When they entered the great hall, hundreds of courtiers filled the space. Pharaoh sat on his golden throne, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. His eyes, lined with black coal, studied the two Hebrew brothers with cold curiosity. Moses had grown up in this palace decades ago, but now he returned as a shepherd demanding freedom for slaves. Aaron stepped forward first, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. The Lord God of Israel says, "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown at the feet of the most powerful ruler on earth. Pharaoh's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go?" His voice dripped with contempt. "I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." The courtiers murmured their agreement, some chuckling at what seemed like an absurd request from insignificant slaves. Moses felt the weight of every eye in the room. This man before him commanded armies, controlled the Nile's flow, and claimed divine authority over millions. Yet Moses knew he carried a greater power. "The God of the Hebrews has met with us," he said firmly. "Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert to sacrifice to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with pestilence or sword." Pharaoh's expression hardened. These weren't mere requests anymore, but veiled threats against his absolute authority. No one challenged Pharaoh in his own palace. No foreign god made demands of Egypt's divine ruler. "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your burdens." His voice rose with anger. The dismissal stung, but worse was coming. Pharaoh's eyes narrowed as he considered how to respond to this insolence. "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens." The implication was clear. He saw their request as dangerous encouragement to rebellious slaves. That very day, Pharaoh issued new orders to the Hebrew taskmasters. The slaves would now gather their own straw for making bricks while maintaining the same daily quota. The extra burden would crush any thoughts of freedom festivals or 3-day journeys into the wilderness. Moses and Aaron left the palace, knowing they had awakened a sleeping giant. Pharaoh's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride in an absolute ruler meant suffering for those under his control. The battle lines were now drawn between two powers that both claimed ultimate authority, one earthly, one divine. Neither would back down easily, and the Hebrew people would feel the weight of this cosmic struggle in their daily lives. Part 5. The Hardened Heart. The first battles of Pharaoh's response to Moses and Aaron's demand had been swift and brutal. As news of the increased labor spread through the Hebrew settlements, angry voices rose against Moses. "Look what you've done to us," the foreman shouted when they found him. "You've made us stink in Pharaoh's nostrils. You've put a sword in his hand to kill us." Moses felt the weight of their accusations. He had expected Pharaoh to resist, but not this immediate cruelty toward his own people. Doubt crept into his mind as he watched families struggle under the impossible burden of gathering straw while meeting the same brick quotas. Had he misunderstood God's plan? Was he truly the right man for this mission? That night, Moses retreated to pray. "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on them, and you have not rescued your people at all." The complaint poured from his heart with raw honesty. God's response came with renewed assurance and a warning about what lay ahead. Pharaoh would not let the people go easily, God explained. In fact, his heart would become harder with each confrontation. This wasn't weakness on God's part, but part of a larger plan that would demonstrate divine power in ways no one could ignore. The concept troubled Moses. Why would God make Pharaoh more stubborn? Why not simply change the king's heart toward mercy? But as he pondered this, Moses began to understand something profound about the nature of human will and divine justice. Pharaoh's hardness wasn't forced upon him. It grew from his own pride and fear of losing control. Each time Moses and Aaron returned to the palace, they found Pharaoh more entrenched in his position. The king's advisors whispered about maintaining Egypt's economic foundation, built on Hebrew labor. Military commanders spoke of setting dangerous precedents that might inspire other enslaved peoples. Religious leaders worried about acknowledging a foreign god's authority over Egypt's divine Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart calcified with each refusal. What began as political calculation became personal defiance. He would not bow to this Hebrew god, no matter the consequences. His pride demanded that he prove Egyptian power superior to any divine threat. Moses watched this transformation with growing understanding. God wasn't creating Pharaoh's stubbornness. He was allowing it to run its full course. Each hardened response would justify increasingly dramatic demonstrations of divine power. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would strip away all pretense and reveal the true source of ultimate authority. The Hebrew people waited in their villages, caught between hope and despair. They had heard Moses speak of liberation, but their daily reality remained unchanged, or had grown worse. Some began to lose faith in their deliverer, while others clung to ancient promises passed down through generations. As tension mounted throughout Egypt, both Pharaoh and Moses prepared for what neither fully understood yet, a series of supernatural events that would shake the kingdom to its foundation and forever change how humanity understood divine power versus earthly rule. Chapter 3, Clash of Powers, The Plagues and Passover. Part 1, Battle of the Gods, Water to Blood, and the Plagues Unleashed. The morning sun reflected off the Nile's surface as Moses and Aaron approached the riverbank where Pharaoh performed his daily rituals. The river was Egypt's lifeline, worshipped as the god Hapi, source of all prosperity. Moses raised his staff high above the sacred waters. When it struck the surface, the clear water turned deep red, thick as blood. The transformation spread rapidly along the entire length of the Nile. Fish floated belly up, their silver scales catching the light like scattered coins. The stench filled the air as Egyptians rushed to the banks, staring in horror at their sacred river. Women who had come to fill water jars stumbled backward, clay vessels crashing to the ground. The water they depended on for drinking, cooking, and bathing had become undrinkable. Pharaoh's magicians performed their tricks, turning small bowls of water red with sleight of hand. They declared this was mere trickery, nothing more than Hebrew magic. But their shallow demonstrations could not restore the mighty Nile. For 7 days, Egyptians dug frantically along the riverbank, searching for clean water while their god lay poisoned. When the blood finally cleared, swarms of frogs emerged from the polluted waters. They covered every surface in Egypt, hopping through palace halls and peasant homes alike. The goddess Heket, depicted with a frog's head, was supposed to bring fertility and life. Now her sacred creatures became a plague of annoyance, croaking through the night and dying in heaps under the morning sun. The frogs died as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving rotting piles that bred clouds of gnats. These tiny insects tormented every Egyptian, from Pharaoh on his throne to slaves in the fields. Even Pharaoh's magicians admitted defeat, telling their king that this was the finger of God working against them. Swarms of flies followed, thick black clouds that filled Egyptian homes while leaving Hebrew settlements untouched. This clear distinction troubled many Egyptians. How could Hebrew magic be so precise? The flies carried disease, and soon Egyptian livestock began dying in the fields while Hebrew animals grazed peacefully nearby. Painful boils erupted on Egyptian skin, making it impossible for priests to perform their sacred duties or for workers to labor effectively. The magicians themselves were covered in sores, unable to stand before Pharaoh to offer their explanations. Egypt's religious system was crumbling under divine pressure. Hail crashed from the sky with supernatural force, destroying crops and killing anyone caught in the open. Lightning danced between the ice stones in ways that defied nature. Pharaoh's own servants begged him to listen to Moses, fearing for their lives and livelihoods. Each plague struck at the heart of Egyptian beliefs. Their gods appeared powerless against the Hebrew God. The Nile, their source of life, had betrayed them. Their sacred animals brought suffering instead of blessing. Their priests could not protect them or even protect themselves. Fear began replacing confidence in Egyptian hearts. Whispers spread through the kingdom that perhaps the Hebrew slaves served a god more powerful than all of Egypt's deities combined. The mounting disasters were breaking Pharaoh's resolve, though his pride still prevented him from yielding to Moses' demands. Part 2. Escalation and devastation. Locusts, darkness, and death. The plagues had already shaken Egypt to its foundation, but the worst was yet to come. As spring arrived, a dark cloud appeared on the horizon. At first, Egyptian farmers thought it might bring rain to their struggling crops. Instead, it brought locusts. The swarm descended like a living storm. Millions of insects covered every surface, devouring what little vegetation remained after the earlier disasters. They ate the leaves from trees, stripped fields bare, and consumed even the wooden handles of tools. The sound was deafening, a constant buzzing and crunching that filled the air day and night. Within hours, Egypt's agricultural heartland became a wasteland. Pharaoh watched his kingdom's economy collapse before his eyes. The locusts destroyed not just this season's harvest, but next year's seed grain. Famine now seemed inevitable. His advisors pleaded with him to release the Hebrew slaves before Egypt faced complete ruin. For a moment, Pharaoh wavered. He called Moses and agreed to let the Hebrew men go worship their God. But when Moses insisted that women, children, and livestock must also leave, Pharaoh's pride flared again. He refused and drove Moses from his presence. The next morning, darkness fell across Egypt. This was not the gentle darkness of night, but an oppressive blackness that seemed to press against people's skin. For 3 days, Egyptians could not see their hands in front of their faces. They stumbled through their homes, unable to work, travel, or even light fires. The darkness was so thick it felt solid, suffocating hope itself. Yet in the Hebrew settlements, the sun continued to shine. Egyptian officials who witnessed this impossible sight returned to their darkened homes deeply troubled. Their gods controlled the sun, they believed, yet somehow the Hebrew God had separated light from darkness according to his will alone. When the darkness lifted, Pharaoh summoned Moses once more. Desperation cracked his voice as he offered to let all the Hebrews leave, but their livestock must remain in Egypt. Moses refused. Every animal would come with them, he declared, for they needed them to sacrifice to their God. Pharaoh's fragile composure shattered. In a rage, he banished Moses forever, threatening death if the Hebrew leader appeared before him again. Moses looked directly into Pharaoh's eyes as he delivered his final warning. One more plague would come, he said quietly. After this, Pharaoh would not only let the Hebrews go, he would drive them out of Egypt. The 10th plague would strike at the heart of every Egyptian family, touching what they valued most, their children. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Pharaoh turned away, but both men knew the final confrontation was approaching. Egypt had endured water turned to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, diseased livestock, boils, hail, and locusts. Darkness had covered the land, yet Pharaoh's stubborn pride had withstood them all. Now Moses prepared for the ultimate test of wills, one that would finally break Egypt's grip on his people forever. Part 3. The night of deliverance, the first Passover. Moses gathered the Hebrew elders as dusk settled over Goshen. The air felt heavy with anticipation and fear. Tomorrow night would bring the final plague, the one that would strike every Egyptian household. But God had given Moses specific instructions to protect the Hebrew families from this terrible judgment. Each household must choose a perfect lamb, Moses told the assembled leaders, his voice steady despite the weight of what was coming. No broken bones, no blemishes. This animal will die so your families can live. The elders listened intently as Moses explained how they must slaughter the lambs at twilight and catch the blood in basins. The most crucial instruction followed. Hebrew families must take hyssop branches, dip them in the lamb's blood, and paint their door frames, the lintel above, and the posts on both sides. When the destroying angel swept through Egypt that night, these marked homes would be passed over. Death would not enter where the blood provided protection. Mothers throughout the Hebrew settlement began preparing unleavened bread, working quickly as Moses had commanded. There would be no time for bread to rise. They must be ready to leave Egypt at a moment's notice. The meal would include bitter herbs, reminders of their harsh slavery, alongside the roasted lamb. As families painted their door frames that evening, children watched with wide eyes. Parents explained that this night would be remembered forever. When your children ask you about this ceremony in years to come, Moses had said, tell them it marks the night the Lord delivered us from Egypt. The blood on their doors told a story of rescue, sacrifice, and God's protection. Inside the marked homes, Hebrew families ate their meal fully dressed for travel. Their sandals stayed on their feet, walking staffs remained in their hands, and their belongings lay packed and ready. They consumed the food hastily, knowing this might be their last meal in the land of their suffering. The night grew darker as Egyptian homes prepared for sleep, unaware of what approached. Hebrew families huddled together, listening for sounds outside their blood-marked doors. Parents held their children closer, trusting in God's promise that the destroyer would pass over their homes. This night created more than just physical protection. It forged a shared memory that would bind the Hebrew people together for generations. The ritual of remembrance, the story of deliverance, and the symbol of the Lamb's blood would become the foundation of their identity as a people chosen and rescued by God. As midnight approached, the Hebrew families waited in their marked homes, knowing that by morning, Egypt's grip on their lives would finally be broken forever. Part 4. The 10th Plague, the death of Egypt's firstborn. As midnight descended over Egypt, death moved through the land like a silent wind. In every Egyptian household, from the grandest palace to the humblest mud brick home, the firstborn sons drew their final breaths. The destroyer God had promised spared no family that lacked the blood of the lamb on their doorposts. In the royal palace, Pharaoh's own son lay still in his chambers. The heir to Egypt's throne, groomed from birth to rule over the greatest empire on earth, would never see another sunrise. The boy who had played in the palace gardens, who had learned the sacred rituals of kingship, was gone. Servants found the prince's body and rushed to wake their god-king with news that would shatter his world. Pharaoh's anguished cries echoed through the palace halls. This man who had proclaimed himself divine, who had boasted that no god could challenge his authority, now knelt beside his dead child. The weight of 9 previous plagues had not broken him, but this final blow crushed something deep within his spirit. His advisors stood helpless, watching their invincible ruler crumble under grief. Throughout Egypt's great cities, similar scenes played out in countless homes. Nobles who had supported Pharaoh's stubborn refusal to free the Hebrews now held their lifeless sons. Military commanders who had enforced the harsh labor policies found their own families destroyed. The very officials who had mocked Moses and dismissed his warnings faced the ultimate consequence of their leader's pride. The political structure of Egypt began to crack under this devastation. These firstborn sons were not just beloved children, but the future leaders of the nation. Every noble family, every administrative household, every military unit had lost its heir. The carefully planned succession lines that maintained Egypt's stability vanished in a single night. Panic spread through the ruling class as they realized their empire's future had died with their sons. As dawn broke, Desperate nobles surrounded Pharaoh's palace. These were the same men who had once urged him to resist Moses' demands. Now they begged their king to release the Hebrew slaves immediately. They feared what might happen if God's anger continued to burn against Egypt. Their grief mixed with terror as they contemplated additional divine punishments. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron before the sun fully rose. Gone was the defiant ruler who had repeatedly hardened his heart against their requests. In his place stood a broken father and a defeated king. His voice shook as he finally spoke the words he had refused to say for months. The Hebrews could leave Egypt immediately, taking their families, their flocks, and their possessions. The king who had once demanded to know this Hebrew god's identity now begged for Moses' blessing. Pharaoh asked Moses to pray for him, hoping that removing the Hebrews might end his nation's suffering. The man who had claimed divine status now pleaded with a former slave for mercy. Word spread quickly through Egypt's Hebrew settlements. After generations of bondage, after months of escalating plagues, their freedom had finally arrived. The blood on their doorposts had protected them through the night of death, and now morning brought the promise of liberation they had barely dared to hope for. Part 5. Pharaoh relents. The Exodus begins. The Hebrew camps erupted into a mixture of celebration and frantic activity as Pharaoh's decree spread from settlement to settlement. Families who had lived as slaves for generations suddenly faced the reality of leaving the only land they had ever known. Children asked their parents what lay beyond Egypt's borders, while elders wept with joy and fear in equal measure. Moses moved quickly between the Hebrew communities, his voice hoarse from giving the same urgent instructions repeatedly. The people must gather their belongings immediately, he told them. They should take only what they could carry, but they must not forget to collect payment for their years of unpaid labor. Egyptian neighbors, desperate to speed the Hebrews' departure, pressed gold jewelry, silver vessels, and fine clothing into their hands. In the royal palace, Pharaoh sat in stunned silence as reports arrived from across his kingdom. Every Egyptian household mourned a firstborn son. His own heir lay cold in the royal tomb, wrapped in the finest linens that could not restore his breath. The king's advisors, many now childless themselves, urged him to let the Hebrews go before more catastrophe struck. The Hebrew preparations revealed the depth of their attachment to Egypt despite their bondage. Mothers packed small treasures their children had made from Nile clay. Fathers loaded tools they had crafted during rare moments of rest. They took seeds from plants that reminded them of home, uncertain what vegetation they might find in the wilderness ahead. Egyptian citizens watched the Hebrew departure with complex emotions. Some felt relief that the plagues might finally end. Others experienced genuine sadness at losing neighbors who had shared their streets for generations. Many Egyptian women embraced Hebrew friends they might never see again, pressing food and water into their hands for the journey. Miriam organized the Hebrew women into groups, ensuring that nursing mothers and pregnant women received extra provisions. Aaron worked with the tribal leaders to establish a marching order that would prevent chaos when hundreds of thousands of people began moving together. The logistics seemed overwhelming, yet somehow the preparations continued. As dawn approached, Hebrew families stood ready at their doorways, bundles on their backs and children clutching their hands. The blood on their doorposts had dried brown in the morning sun, a visible reminder of the night that changed everything. They had entered that evening as slaves. They emerged as a free people carrying the promise of their own land. Pharaoh's final message reached Moses as the first Hebrew groups began walking toward Egypt's borders. The king's words were simple and desperate. "Take your flocks and your herds and be gone, and bless me also." The most powerful ruler in the ancient world now begged for the prayers of the people he had oppressed. The great departure had begun, marking the end of Hebrew slavery and the start of their journey toward an unknown but promised future. Chapter 4. Through the Sea and the Wilderness, Triumphs and Rebellion. Part 1. The Pursuit, Pharaoh's Regret, and the Egyptian army's charge. The Hebrew camps bustled with nervous energy as families packed their belongings and prepared for the long journey ahead. Moses walked among his people, offering words of comfort and direction, but his eyes kept scanning the horizon behind them. Something felt different in the air today. The silence from Egypt seemed too complete, too final. Back in his palace, Pharaoh paced the marble floors of his throne room. His advisors watched him carefully, knowing the storm brewing in their ruler's mind. "What have I done?" he muttered, his voice echoing off the walls. The reality of his decision hit him like a physical blow. 600,000 Hebrew men, plus their families, had just walked away from Egypt. These were his workers, his builders, his labor force that had made Egypt wealthy and powerful. His counselors seized the moment. "My lord," one ventured, "they have taken our strength with them. Who will build our cities? Who will work our fields?" Another added fuel to the growing fire. "They carry our gold and silver, gifts we gave them in our haste. Egypt grows poor while they grow rich in the wilderness." Pharaoh's face darkened with each word. The plagues had broken his spirit temporarily, but now anger replaced his fear. Pride, that ancient enemy of rulers, whispered in his ear. How would other nations view Egypt's weakness? How could he have let slaves dictate terms to the greatest empire on earth? "Prepare my chariot," he commanded, his voice sharp as bronze. "Ready the army, 600 of our finest chariots, and select troops to support them. We will bring them back." The palace exploded into activity. Horses were harnessed, weapons sharpened, and armor polished. The thunder of wheels and hooves soon filled the Egyptian streets as the mighty war machine prepared to roll. Pharaoh himself would lead this pursuit, determined to reclaim what he saw as his property. Meanwhile, the Hebrew column stretched for miles across the desert landscape. Children cried from exhaustion, elderly struggled with the pace, and everyone wondered where Moses was leading them. They had celebrated their freedom just days before, but now reality set in. They were truly alone in the wilderness, carrying everything they owned, with no clear destination except Moses' promises of a promised land. The sound reached them first, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. Dust clouds appeared on the horizon, and soon the terrifying sight became clear. Egyptian war chariots, their bronze fittings glinting in the sunlight, were gaining ground fast. The professional soldiers marched in perfect formation behind them, their spears creating a forest of deadly points. Panic spread through the Hebrew camps like wildfire. People dropped their bundles and gathered around Moses, their voices rising in fear and anger. The Egyptian army represented everything they had hoped to escape, and now it was bearing down on them with deadly intent. The chase had begun, and both sides knew only one could survive this confrontation. Part 2. The Parting of the Red Sea, Escape and Miracle. With the Egyptian army bearing down on them, the Hebrew people found themselves trapped between two impossible choices. Behind them, the thunder of chariot wheels grew louder with each passing moment. Ahead of them stretched the Red Sea, its waters dark and forbidding under the desert sun. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The situation seemed hopeless. The people's fear turned to anger as they surrounded Moses. "Did you bring us out here to die?" they shouted. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to lead us to this wasteland?" Their voices carried the weight of desperation and betrayal. These were not warriors but families with children, elderly parents, and precious few possessions. They had trusted Moses to lead them to freedom, and now death seemed certain. Moses felt the crushing weight of leadership in that moment. Behind him, dust clouds marked the approach of Pharaoh's finest soldiers. Before him, his people's faces showed terror and accusation. Yet something deeper than fear moved within him. He raised his staff toward the sea and called upon the God who had sent him to Egypt. What happened next defied every law of nature the Hebrews knew. The sea began to move, not in gentle waves, but in a massive, deliberate parting. Water rose like great walls on either side, held back by an invisible force. Between these towering barriers of seawater, dry ground appeared. The sound was like thunder and wind combined, yet the path remained solid and safe. The people stood frozen in amazement until Moses urged them forward. The first family stepped onto the seafloor with trembling legs. Their children looked up in wonder at the walls of water that should have crushed them, but instead stood firm as mountains. Fish swam in the transparent barriers above their heads. Seaweed danced in the suspended depths. As hundreds of thousands of people crossed this impossible bridge, the Egyptian chariots reached the shore. Pharaoh's commanders saw the miracle, but their pride would not let them turn back. They drove their horses into the sea, their heavy chariots churning the sandy bottom. The walls of water remained steady as the Hebrews completed their crossing. Then, as the last Hebrew foot touched the far shore and the final Egyptian chariot entered the seabed, the waters crashed back together. The sound echoed across the desert like the closing of a giant door. When the foam settled, not a single Egyptian soldier remained. The sea had swallowed Pharaoh's entire army. The Hebrews stood on the eastern shore, breathing hard and staring at the calm waters that had just delivered them from certain death. Their fear transformed into something else entirely. They had witnessed power beyond human understanding, and they knew their journey had only just begun. Part 3. Miriam's Song, Celebration and New Fears. The silence broke with a single voice. Miriam, Moses' sister, stepped forward with a tambourine in her weathered hands. She had watched over Moses when he was a baby floating in the Nile basket. She had witnessed plagues ravage Egypt. Now, standing on this strange shore with the taste of sea spray still on her lips, she began to sing. Her voice rang clear across the gathered crowd. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." The words poured from her heart like water from a spring. Other women joined her, pulling out their own instruments, their voices weaving together in celebration. The men picked up the song, their deep voices adding strength to the melody. Children who had cowered in terror moments before now clapped their hands and laughed. The elderly, who had feared they would die as slaves, tapped their feet on the sandy ground. For the first time since leaving Egypt, the entire nation moved as one people bound by shared joy. The dancing began slowly. Miriam stepped and swayed, her tambourine keeping rhythm. Soon hundreds of women followed her lead, their robes swirling in the desert wind. Men lifted their children on their shoulders. Families embraced, tears of relief streaming down their faces. They had seen the impossible. They had walked between walls of water and lived to tell about it. Yet even as they celebrated, questions crept into quiet conversations. Where would they go now? The vast wilderness stretched endlessly before them, brown hills rolling toward the horizon. They had left behind the familiar rhythms of Egyptian life, harsh as it was. They knew where to find water there, where to get food, how to survive. Here, nothing looked familiar. Some mothers held their babies closer, wondering how they would feed them in this empty land. Older men studied the barren landscape and worried about finding shelter. The euphoria of escape began mixing with the cold reality of an uncertain future. They were free, but freedom brought its own fears. Moses watched his people sing and dance, but he also saw the worried glances and hushed conversations. He understood their joy and their fear. The miracle at the sea had proven God's power, but it had also thrust them into unknown territory. They would need more than one miracle to survive what lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher and the celebration gradually quieted, the people began to pack their belongings. The memory of their deliverance would travel with them, a source of strength for the difficult days coming. They had seen water part and armies drown. Whatever challenges awaited in the wilderness, they carried this moment with them. Part 4. Hunger, Thirst, and Manna, the Trials of Faith. 3 days into the wilderness, the celebration songs had faded to worried whispers. The Hebrews trudged across sandy ground under a merciless sun, their water skins growing lighter with each passing hour. Children cried from thirst while their mothers rationed the last drops of precious liquid. The miracle at the sea seemed like a distant dream when faced with the immediate reality of empty stomachs and parched throats. The complaints began as quiet murmurs among small groups. "At least in Egypt we had bread," someone muttered. "We knew where our next meal would come from." Others nodded in agreement, remembering the fish and vegetables they had eaten as slaves. Freedom meant little when faced with starvation. The grumbling grew louder as families gathered around cold campsites, unable to find enough fuel for cooking fires. Moses felt the weight of 600,000 people pressing on his shoulders. Every hungry cry, every plea for water, every angry accusation cut through him like a blade. "You brought us out here to die," they shouted at their leader. "We should have stayed in Egypt where we had food." The very people who had danced with joy after crossing the sea now looked at him with desperate, accusing eyes. Their faith, so strong just days before, crumbled under the harsh reality of survival. When the people woke on the sixth morning, something strange covered the ground like frost. Small white flakes lay scattered across the desert floor, sweet to the taste and filling to the stomach. "What is it?" they asked each other in their language. The question itself became the name, manna. Moses explained this was God's provision, enough for each day but no more. Those who tried to hoard it found their extra portions crawling with worms by morning. The daily gathering of manna became a ritual of trust. Each family collected exactly what they needed, learning to depend on tomorrow's promise rather than today's anxiety. Children learned to look for the white flakes each dawn, understanding that their survival came not from their own efforts, but from divine care. Yet even with full bellies, the people continued to test Moses and question God's plan when water grew scarce or the journey seemed too difficult. At Massa and Meribah, when the wells ran dry, the people nearly stoned Moses in their fury. Only when he struck the rock and water gushed forth did their anger turn to shame. These moments of crisis became lessons in faith, teaching the former slaves that freedom required trust in the unseen. They were learning to become a nation not just through shared hardship, but through shared dependence on the God who had delivered them. The wilderness was transforming them, stripping away their slave mentality one difficult day at a time. Each morning's manna and each discovery of water reminded them that their journey had a purpose beyond mere survival. They were being prepared for something greater than they yet understood. Part 5. Sinai's Glory. The Giving of the Ten Commandments. The wilderness had taught them to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited at Mount Sinai. 3 months had passed since they fled Egypt, and the former slaves had grown accustomed to daily miracles. Yet as they approached the towering mountain, something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation. Moses felt the familiar call drawing him upward. The same voice that had spoken from a burning bush now summoned him to climb higher than he had ever gone. The people watched from below as their leader disappeared into the clouds that wrapped around Sinai's peak like a thick blanket. Days passed without word. Some began to whisper doubts, but most waited with growing excitement. On the mountain, Moses encountered something beyond human description. The presence he met there was both terrifying and wonderful, ancient yet immediate. The voice that spoke seemed to come from everywhere at once, yet it was as clear as conversation between friends. This was not just another moment of guidance. This was the moment everything would change. The 10 Commandments emerged from this encounter like thunder made into words. Each statement was simple enough for a child to understand, yet profound enough to shape entire civilizations. No murder, no theft, no false witness. Honor your parents. Keep the Sabbath holy. Each command addressed the fundamental challenges of human community, the basic rules needed for people to live together in peace. But these were more than rules. They represented a covenant, a two-way promise between the divine and this ragged band of former slaves. The God who had freed them from Egypt was now offering them something unprecedented, a direct relationship, complete with responsibilities and blessings. They would be a chosen people, but that choice came with obligations. When Moses descended with the stone tablets, his face shone so brightly that people could barely look at him. The entire mountain shook with thunder and lightning. Smoke billowed from its peak as if it were on fire. The people trembled, not from fear alone, but from awe at witnessing something sacred breaking into their ordinary world. The ceremony that followed bound them together as nothing had before. They were no longer just refugees wandering in the desert. They had become a nation with laws, with purpose, with divine backing for their journey ahead. The commandments carved in stone would outlast every empire that rose and fell around them. Yet even as they celebrated this moment of glory, challenges remained ahead. The wilderness still stretched before them, and human nature had not changed overnight. These laws would be tested, broken, and renewed countless times, but the foundation had been laid. At Sinai, a people discovered their identity and their destiny, carrying forward a moral framework that would echo through history long after the mountain's thunder faded into memory. Chapter 5, Lessons in the Wilderness, Covenant and Consequence. Part 1, golden calf and broken promises, idolatry at Sinai. Moses had been gone too long. 40 days on Mount Sinai felt like 40 lifetimes to the Hebrew people camped below. The mountains still smoked and thundered, but their leader had vanished into the clouds. Fear crept through the camp like morning fog. What if Moses never returned? What if he had died up there among the fire and lightning? The people gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother. Their voices rose in desperate pleading. "Make us gods who will go before us," they demanded. "This Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him." Aaron looked at the worried faces surrounding him. These were the same people who had witnessed miracles in Egypt, who had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. Yet now they trembled with doubt. Aaron made a choice that would haunt him forever. "Bring me your gold earrings," he told them. The women, men, and children stripped off their jewelry without hesitation. Aaron melted the gold and shaped it into a calf, like the gods they remembered from Egypt. The people erupted in celebration. "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt," they shouted. What happened next shocked even Aaron. The people didn't just admire their new idol, they threw a wild festival. They built an altar, offered sacrifices, and danced around the golden calf. Food and wine flowed freely. The celebration turned rowdy, then shameful. The same people who had promised to obey God's commands just weeks earlier now broke every rule with abandon. Up on the mountain, God's anger burned hot. He told Moses what was happening below. "Your people have become corrupt," God said. "They have turned away quickly from what I commanded them. Let me destroy them and make you into a great nation instead." Moses felt torn between his loyalty to God and his love for his people. He could have stepped aside and let divine judgment fall. Instead, he pleaded for mercy. "Why should the Egyptians say you brought these people out just to kill them in the mountains?" Moses argued. "Remember your promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." When Moses finally descended the mountain carrying the stone tablets of God's law, he saw the golden calf and the wild dancing. His anger exploded. He hurled the sacred tablets to the ground, shattering them into pieces. The broken stones perfectly symbolized the broken covenant. Moses confronted Aaron directly. "What did these people do to you that you led them into such sin?" Aaron's excuse was pitiful. "You know how prone these people are to evil. They gave me gold, I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf." The crisis demanded decisive action. Moses called for loyalty. "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The tribe of Levi responded. That day, 3,000 people died for their rebellion. The cost of broken promises had come due, yet mercy followed judgment. Moses returned to the mountain, offering his own life as payment for his people's sin. God chose forgiveness over destruction, but the relationship had changed. Trust, once broken, would take time to rebuild. Part 2. Building the Tabernacle. A nation organizes worship. After the devastating rebellion at Mount Sinai, the Hebrew camp stood fractured and uncertain. 3,000 lay dead, and the golden calf's ashes mixed with bitter water still lingered in their memory. Moses had interceded for their lives, but the people wondered if God would ever dwell among them again. The answer came in an unexpected command that would transform their broken community into something magnificent. God called Moses to the mountain once more, this time with detailed instructions for building a sacred dwelling place. The tabernacle, as it would be known, represented far more than a tent. It offered the Hebrews a chance to participate in something holy, to pour their skills and resources into creating a home for the divine presence they had nearly lost forever. The instructions were precise and elaborate. Skilled craftsmen like Bezalel and Oholiab emerged from the crowd, their hands suddenly blessed with supernatural ability. These men, who had once shaped bricks in Egyptian kilns, now carved intricate designs in gold and fashioned delicate fabrics with threads of blue, purple, and scarlet. Every measurement mattered. Every detail carried meaning. The people responded with remarkable generosity. Women brought their bronze mirrors to be melted down for the washing basin. Men offered gold rings and jewelry. Skilled seamstresses worked late into the night, weaving curtains that would separate the holy from the common. The same hands that had crafted the golden calf now created something beautiful for God's glory. As the structure took shape, the camp itself transformed. Tribes organized around the tabernacle's central position, creating order from chaos. The Levites received special duties as caretakers and assistants to the priests. Daily routines of sacrifice and worship brought rhythm to their wilderness existence. The constant presence of the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night reminded everyone that God had not abandoned them. The tabernacle's design spoke a language of symbols the people gradually learned to read. The outer court welcomed all Israelites, while the holy place remained restricted to priests. The innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, housed the Ark of the Covenant with the stone tablets Moses had carried down from Sinai. This progression from common to sacred taught them about approaching God with reverence and preparation. When construction finally ended, something extraordinary happened. The cloud that had led them through the wilderness descended and filled the tabernacle with such glory that even Moses could not enter. The people watched in awe as God took up residence in their midst. Their rebellion had been forgiven, their community restored, and their identity as a holy nation finally taking shape. The tabernacle became their center, both physically and spiritually. It moved when they moved, stopped when they stopped. It reminded them daily that they were not merely escaped slaves wandering aimlessly, but a chosen people carrying God's presence through the wilderness toward a promised destination. Yet the years ahead would test whether this renewed commitment could survive the long journey still before them. Part 3. Wandering Years, Rebellion, Discipline, and Renewal. The tabernacle's completion had filled the Hebrews with hope, but the wilderness would soon test every ounce of their newfound commitment. What began as a journey that should have taken weeks stretched into decades of wandering, and the desert became their classroom for some of life's hardest lessons. The trouble started almost immediately after leaving Sinai. The people began complaining about everything: the food, the water, the endless walking. They grumbled to Moses constantly, their voices rising in the desert heat. "Why did you bring us out here to die?" they demanded. "We were better off in Egypt." Their selective memory conveniently forgot the whips and chains, remembering only the fish and vegetables they had eaten as slaves. Moses found himself caught between an increasingly frustrated people and a God who expected obedience. Each complaint felt like a personal attack on his leadership. When scouts returned from Canaan with reports of giants and fortified cities, the people's fear exploded into open rebellion. "Let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt," they cried. Only 2 scouts, Joshua and Caleb, urged the people to trust God's promise and enter the land. That night changed everything. God's patience finally reached its limit. The generation that had witnessed the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, and the giving of the law would not enter the promised land. They would wander in the wilderness until every adult over 20 had died, except for faithful Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses himself would be denied entry after losing his temper and striking a rock instead of speaking to it as commanded. The sentence was harsh but clear. 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for each day the scouts had spent in Canaan. An entire generation would learn obedience through consequence. The desert became their prison, but also their training ground. During these long years, Moses watched his people slowly change. The slaves who had left Egypt died off one by one, replaced by children who had known only freedom. These younger Hebrews grew up with the law as their foundation and the tabernacle as their center. They learned to trust God's provision of manna each morning and water from unexpected places. There were more rebellions along the way. Korah challenged Moses' authority and was swallowed by the earth. People died from snake bites until Moses lifted up a bronze serpent for healing. Each crisis became a lesson in trust and obedience. Gradually, something remarkable happened. The scattered tribes began functioning as a true nation. They learned to move together, camp together, and worship together. The covenant that had seemed so fragile at Sinai grew stronger through testing. As the 40th year approached, Moses looked out over a transformed people. The frightened slaves were gone, replaced by a generation ready to claim their inheritance. The wilderness had done its work, preparing them for the battles and blessings that lay ahead in the Promised Land. Part 4. The Death of Moses. Vision of the Promised Land. Moses climbed Mount Nebo alone, his weathered hands gripping his staff for the last time. At 120 years old, His eyes remained clear and his strength undiminished. Yet he knew this would be his final journey. The weight of 40 years in the wilderness pressed upon his shoulders as he ascended the rocky path. From the mountain's peak, a breathtaking vista spread before him. There lay the promised land in all its glory. The Jordan River winding through fertile valleys, green hills dotted with ancient cities, and orchards heavy with fruit. Moses could see Jericho nestled among palm trees, the mountains of Judah rising in purple majesty, and the distant shimmer of the Mediterranean Sea. Everything God had promised Abraham centuries before now lay within sight. His heart swelled with bittersweet emotion. The frightened slaves who had stumbled out of Egypt were now a mighty nation camped in the plains below. Through every crisis and rebellion, through the golden calf incident and countless moments of doubt, they had survived and grown stronger. The covenant forged at Sinai had shaped them into God's chosen people. Moses remembered the burning bush where it all began, when God called him to confront Pharaoh. He had been reluctant then, convinced he was unfit for such a monumental task. Yet here stood the evidence of divine faithfulness, a transformed people ready to claim their inheritance. The plagues, the Red Sea crossing, the giving of the law, the wilderness wanderings, every step had led to this moment. A profound sense of completion filled his spirit. He had carried this burden of leadership through decades of complaints and challenges. Now Joshua would take the reins, young and capable, equipped to lead the conquest ahead. The transition felt natural and right. Moses had brought them to the threshold. Joshua would lead them home. The elderly prophet reflected on the lessons learned in the desert crucible. The Israelites had discovered that freedom meant more than escape from slavery. It required discipline, faith, and commitment to something greater than themselves. They had learned to trust God's provision even when circumstances seemed impossible. Most importantly, they had learned that their identity came not from where they had been, but from whose they were. As the sun began to set, painting the promised land in golden hues, Moses felt a deep peace settle over him. His work was finished. The covenant would endure beyond his lifetime, carried forward by people who understood both its privileges and responsibilities. The promises made to the patriarchs would soon find their fulfillment in the land spread out before him. Death came gently, as God had promised. Moses closed his eyes one final time, having seen the culmination of the greatest rescue story ever told. Below in the valley, a nation prepared to cross the Jordan, carrying with them the faith and laws that would define them forever.